Bob has a lifelong interest in Australian military and police history, particularly the colonial era of the 19th century through to 1945, and he was a member of the Victoria Police Force for 15 years, serving in both uniform and the criminal investigation branch as a detective. I can see where the history comes in. When Bob left the police force, he studied at university as a mature age student before eventually completing a PhD in Victorian military history at the University of Melbourne. In recent years, he coordinated the Victorian Defence's Project 1803 to 1945, which was a multidisciplinary team of historians, archaeologists, engineers, mapping experts, and the members of the public as they recorded Victoria's military history. Bob has been a member of the Professional Historians Association of Victoria since 2008. In fact, I could briefly mention to Bob about finds within the mines during World War II, seen mines at him, wasn't aware of that. Bob has a long association with Fort Queenscliff. He is currently Secretary of the Fort Queenscliff Heritage Association Incorporated and is involved in the Fort's Heritage Education and Training Program. He lives in the Bellarine Peninsula and Ocean Grove. So please welcome Bob.
Thanks, Rod. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk tonight, and especially for the wonderful dinner. It was a great surprise, and thank you very much. Okay, what I wanted to talk about tonight is partly about Fort Queenscliff, give you a little background story, but also about a project that the Army has actually engaged us to consult with relating to Fort Queenscliff and modern day defence. So I'll talk a little bit about the fort, give you a background to the fort and defence, and then what the Army's doing at the moment. So you'll have to excuse me because I'll do things like this and I'll forget that I'm actually holding a microphone, or I'll talk into this. So just bear with me, please. So Gibraltar of the South. Back in the 1880s, the defences around Victoria were so complex and the biggest defence scheme outside of the UK that it was known as the Gibraltar of the South. It was so complex, and over the next 60-odd years, it certainly deserved that reputation, or sobriquet. So, I'm going to talk about the heads. Now, everybody's familiar with the entrance to Port Phillip Bay, Melbourne to the north, Geelong to the west, Queenscliff on one side and Nepean on the other. So, we're talking about what's happening at the heads, and eventually a fortress developed. Shortlands Bluff, I think everybody's familiar with that, rises about 23 metres above the sea level. It's a vertical bluff, and it's the site of where Fort Queenscliff is. Looking at this photo, you can see the Black Lighthouse, the Pilot's Row, and it was also the battery of originally three 68-pounder guns and mounted on Shortlands Bluff, and the idea was that it would fire across the heads to stop any enemy ship. There was a big debate, do you defend Melbourne at Melbourne, or do you defend Melbourne at the heads? And this is back in the days of the gold rush, where there were massive amounts of gold being stored in Melbourne, and it was open to attack. The Russians were interested, the French were interested, the Americans at one stage, even South Australians were interested at one stage. And New South Wales, not many people know, but New South Wales actually invaded Victoria. So don't get me started on that. I just thought I'd throw that in. So, give you an idea, Shortlands Bluff was the first battery at Queenscliff and what later became Fort Queenscliff. By 1880s, the fort as we know it was now built. There was a wall, a keep, a moat. There were bridges across the moat, but they weren't actually drawbridges. And nobody knows why they built a medieval fort at Queenscliff. And when I was doing part of my PhD studies, I came to the conclusion that it was basically to keep the town people out. It was totally useless as a defence site. The Americans had invented what they call a little boat howitzer, and it was a cannon which came ashore in a longboat, and you could set it up 200 yards away and blow the wall apart. So it was totally useless. But it looked impressive and still looks impressive. This is a view from Shortlands Bluff that the original cannoneers would have seen, a ship passing through the heads. So it gives you an idea of ships actually passed pretty closely to Shortlands Bluff under the guns. Fort Queenscliff, as we know it, dates from 1860. By 1880s, it was the headquarters of the fortress at the heads. It was controlling on both sides, Nepean and Queenscliff. It stayed a fort up until the Second World War. By 1946, it closed down as a defence installation, a defensive fort, and became the Army Command and Staff College, which is essentially training for majors and lieutenant colonels and middle ranking officers who had the potential to go on to become very senior officers like generals. So the Command and Staff College operated from 1946 until 2000, when it transferred to the Defence Force Academy at Canberra. And the Army's personnel branch moved in. And Bruce was actually the commander of the scheme, or Soldier Career Management Agency, and it kept track of transfers and promotions, and yeah, it was basically a personnel branch. They left, and it was replaced by the current mob, which is Defence Archives, and their job is to digitise all Army personnel records. So it's one of those jobs which is getting closer, smaller and smaller, and the more work they do, the less they've got to do, and eventually they're going to do themselves out of a job. The other people at the fort at the moment, the other Army unit, is the Army History Unit. Between Defence Archives and the AHU, there's about 15 people, and it's getting smaller and smaller. Eventually, and what we're aiming for is when Army moves out and it can be opened up to the public and taken over into public ownership. At the moment, it's great having the Army there because they pay for the maintenance, but security is a real pain in the neck, and we'd like to see it thrown wide open. So we're planning, the Heritage Association is planning at the moment, for that day when the Army does finally leave us. So that's a potted history of Fort Queenscliff. At the moment, myself and another fellow, Andrew Dagg, are the only two historians in the country actually looking at how Australia was defended over the last 150 years. And we were surprised about this. The Army found out what we were doing, and they actually invited us up to lecture to the Army senior officers last November in Canberra, the Army History Conference. How did you actually defend Australia in the past? The Army has been so used to offensive operations like Afghanistan and Iraq that they've lost track of how do you actually defend Australia? So they're completely pivoting away from offensive to now defensive. And they looked at the work we were doing and said, hang on, this is exactly what the Army officers of today need to know about. So one of the things that they look at is how do you use bathymetry and topography? Now, you get a bonus prize if you know what bathymetry is. Somebody knows. You're not supposed to know that. Bathymetry is underwater topography. So topography is land-based, mountains and things like that, but bathymetry is the shape of the underwater land formations. So we looked at how the river course of the Yarra from Melbourne all the way down to the heads, and if you look at this picture, it comes down on the left and then swings into the South Channel before passing out through the heads. And if you look at the heads, you can actually see a dark blue band, very narrow, and that's an escarpment. So as the water passes over it, in and out, it sets up massive currents, and it's one of the most treacherous places in the world to actually enter, and all because of this escarpment. The only way an enemy force could actually attack Melbourne was to, one, get past Queenscliff, and you either went straight ahead on the Western Channel to attack Geelong, or turn right into South Channel to follow the old river course up towards Melbourne. So they knew if they could defend these two channels, they could stop an enemy approaching Melbourne. So In the 1860s, they decided to put a battery of 3 guns at Shortlands Bluff, and as you can see from the red circle, that is the range of the guns. They could basically fire in an arc. The blue ones are the shipping channels. So an enemy ship had to pass into either the West Channel or the South Channel under the range of the guns. They didn't have any choice. Now, this is what the Army was really fascinated about. How was the topography and bathymetry used to set up a defensive system? And they want to look at doing exactly the same thing in Northern Australia today. But they didn't know how to do it. They didn't know how it had been done in the past. So they were quite surprised when we went to Canberra and actually showed them. In the 1880s, the defences became more complex. They now had minefields covering both channels, and there were a number of forts at Queenscliff, over at Nepean, and along the South Channel. The minefields were contact and electrically set off, so as a ship would actually pass over the minefield, they'd either do it as a contact mine, they touch the mine, it would blow up, or as they passed a certain point, somebody on shore would actually close an electric signal and set the mines off. So there were 2 types of minefields. Now, this is in the 1880s. The other thing was we looked at the combined defence scheme. How did the forts, the military and the Navy actually work together to set up a defensive scheme? Now, keep in mind an enemy force was being channelled into one of these 2 places. I don't like using the term, but basically setting up a killing field, where if you entered this, you would be destroyed if you were an enemy. So the dots are actually the Victorian Navy ships, and the idea was that they would set up a hammer and an anvil. An enemy force would pass into the channel and the minefields, and they would be hit from one side and forced up against the guns of the forts on the land. So it was a hammer and anvil approach. And again, this was quite innovative. It had never been done anywhere else in the British Empire. By the First World War, the defences were so complex that there was absolutely no way known an enemy ship was going to pass through without being hit by one or more forts or the minefields. By the Second World War, this is where it really got complex, and we're starting now to talk about a 3D type of defence system. You can see there was a dotted line between Point Lonsdale and Nepean. And has anybody heard of the Magic Eye? And there still remains of it on the Point Lonsdale shore. And the idea was it was an infrared beam which projected right across to the other side at Nepean. And as it's, here I go again, I'm getting confused. The beam would go across, and any ship that broke that beam would automatically set off alarms. Searchlights, gun crews would come to, and they'd be looking for an enemy ship. The trouble was the fishing boats were also setting it off, and it was driving the soldiers crazy. Everybody was getting really upset, even high waves. So they got around it by actually raising the beam a metre. So that was one thing, infrared, in World War II. They also had what they called, excuse me, a degaussing range. And the idea was that the Germans, and this relates to the mines we're talking about, there were 2 types of mines. There were either contact mines, where a ship would touch a mine and set it off, or there was a magnetic mine, and the natural magnetic field of a ship passing over a magnetic field would break the circuit and again set the mine off. And the Germans had developed these magnetic mines to a high degree of sophistication, and they were laying them out in Bass Strait. So the idea was that you reverse the polarity of the ship by passing over this degaussing range. And instead of having a magnetic field flowing one way, it reversed it. So you could safely pass over a magnetic mine without setting it off. So that was set up at the heads. There was also indicator loops, and the idea was that any submarine which came through the heads would pass over a loop, which again was a magnetic coil, and the submarine would then set off alarms and troops would be called out. So by 1942, the defences of the heads were actually quite complex. Then they took it a step further. They started to look further offshore and they thought, why wait until an enemy could actually be at the heads? But they should be detected well out into Bass Strait. So now we've got radar, and radar was operating well out into Bass Strait. There was a highly advanced, what they call advanced chain overseas, or OCO radar, and there was only one in Victoria, and it was based now at the Ballerine Secondary College. And it could project way out into Bass Strait, almost to Tasmania. So the radar coverage was quite incredible. And it was all linked to fighter planes, bombers, the RAAF, the Navy. It was all a coordinated 3D defence scheme now being developed, and all being based at Fort Queenscliff. The other thing the Army was quite interested in was this concept also of a 3D defence and prohibiting or denying access to an area by an enemy force. And I said, that's all very good, but what happens if the enemy attacks the rear of the fort, the forces? And they realised back in the 1860s there was no protection from the rear of the battery, so an enemy force could land troops at Torquay or Barwon Heads and actually attack the fort from behind. By the 1880s, they actually had rudimentary defences at the heads and also behind the fort, you know the narrows at Point Lonsdale, where the highway passes over a very narrow strip of land. So there were trenches there. They realised that the rear of the fort was actually vulnerable, which is why they put the wall in there. By the Second World War, they thought, nah, we've got to keep people further out. So what they did was actually set up a defence in depth. Now, this Victorian Defences project that we were developing and researching, we've identified 250 sites just on the Ballerine and Geelong relating to this defence network. And it's everything from bombing ranges to murder sites to bunkers to communications cables. It's massive and it's all connected. So right across the Ballerine Peninsula with thousands of troops. There was, especially across the main highways and the railway, there were checkpoints where you had to pass under machine guns. There were trenches, there were troops there, and really interesting, one of the things was they thought of a tank trap. Now I came across a map in dated 1945 of a tank trap, and you think, well, what's a tank trap? It literally is a trap for tanks. And the idea was that if the Japanese landed tanks at Barwon Heads and swung around towards the fort, they would have to hit this ditch. And the remains are still there, but now flooded. So it gives you an idea. This extended from the Port Arlington Road right across the Ballerine Highway, right around to Point Lonsdale. And there were 3 of them planned. Only one was built, but it zigzags all over the place. And we've managed to track exactly where it was and which properties it went through, and quite a bit actually survives. So defending the defences was just as important as actually having the defences. And this is where the Army's actually been quite intrigued, because it's now saying this is how you should do it, this is what worked in the past, and this is how it should actually work today. So they're intrigued. So that's basically what we're working on at the moment. It's a huge project. We've just published a history of Victorian Defence from 1803. Not many people know that the first battery was over at Sorrento when Lieutenant Collins had the settlement there, and then we've traced it all the way through right up until 1945, and we looked at how this defensive system actually worked in depth. So it's really complex, and I didn't even know about the mines. So there is so much more to find out.
Yeah, I was going to say that when Rod mentioned it earlier on, I can see links in the research we've done with Swan Island, Swan Bay, all the photos and stuff, but I've got documents from the naval records that just seem to be kept locked up across the top, and I can't find anything much more to fill in gaps. There's very, very little. We were hoping our mate Richard Miles, now that he's got a bit of a say. But surely it would be unclassified now.
A lot of it is, but you've got to hunt for it. It's taken probably 30 years to get where we are at the moment. Searching through National Archives.
I've been 3, so I've got a bit ahead of me.
But it's all about, like, there's people working on various aspects. Like the Army said, you're the only ones working on a defensive system in Australia, you know, in this sort of depth. And we thought we were alone. Now we find out that there's other people working on it too. So, yeah, it needs a bit of publicity, I think, to start drawing people and groups together, and let's work together on this.
I know that some of the records and things that I've found, I forwarded on to the Naval Historical Society, and they said, oh, thanks, you filled some gaps, here's some that we've got.
Yeah.
But it's not that much.
Yeah.
There's must be heaps more.
There is so much more. Like when we looked at, you know, the 250 odd defence sites, that's not all. There's more sites out there.
So what did people think that channel was before you realised or found out it was a tank trap?
No idea. The landowners just thought it was a natural waterway, but it's this one's at Point Lonsdale, but you know where the Port Arlington Queenscliff Road is? It starts there near the. Is there a tomato business there? Tomato. Yeah, it goes past Lakers, crosses over near Suma Park, crosses over the highway, and then drops down to Lake Victoria. Yeah, and you can actually see, using Google Earth, you can still see at certain times of the year where the outline of the tank trap goes. Yeah, and there's still quite a few samples of it like this. Yep.
Did Victoria have its own defence personnel before Federation? Did Victoria have its own Department of Defence?
Yes, it did, yeah. Originally, up until the 1850s, they were imperial soldiers, and then during the late 1850s, they set up the volunteer force, which was cavalry, rifles, artillery and that, made up of citizen soldiers, and they would come together and serve voluntarily. So they were called the volunteers. Then in 1883, they disbanded them because they were pretty useless, and then set up the militia, which was a paid service, and you were actually for the first time required to turn up if there was a war. The volunteers could choose not to. So it wasn't very effective. So right through until, Federation.
People who went to the Boer War,
Yeah.
who organised them?
It was done by each colony, and then after Federation it was done as an Australian force. So Victoria sent various contingents, so did the other colonies. But a lot of them came out of the militia.
And can I just ask you whether, did any enemy ships in the Second World War come through the heads?
Wow, it's funny you should say that. I wrote a book called Murder at the Fort, and one of the fellows I interviewed, this is about two soldiers who were killed in 1942, and one of them was a 17-year-old guard who was shot whilst on sentry duty about 3 o'clock one morning. When they went searching, because he disappeared and he'd actually been taken down to the beach, and when they went looking for him, one fellow found what he said were cow prints, and he came off a dairy farm. So when he looked at the cow prints, he said, well, what are they doing here? So he explained to Army intelligence, there's all cow prints in this restricted area. And he said, they're not cow prints, they're Japanese footprints. So, did the Japanese come ashore in September 1942, kill a sentry? Because if so, the same weapon was used to kill another one 3 months earlier. So was it the Japanese or somebody pretending to be the Japanese? Yeah. It was originally supposed to be, so Pope's Eye is that dotted line going up to the right. The top dot is about where Pope's Eye is. It was originally supposed to be in a fort in its own right and was man-made. And the idea was that they would have you can see where the red dot representing Queenscliff, Swan Island and Pope's Eye would close the Western Channel, so setting up a triangular field of fire. By the time Pope's Eye had started, the weapons available to Swan Island and Queenscliff far outstripped the need for Pope's Eye, so it was never finished. It's just the annulus now of rocks, but it was never actually built, and that's why it was obsolete.
Was it going to be a circle?
Yes.
So it was going to be a full circle and
Yes.
not have an issue?
Yeah. So there was going to be a fort there. Yeah. I don't know if you know about South Channel Fort. It was a man-made fort as well. It was exactly the same as Pope's Eye, but a lot bigger, except they then completed that and they went ahead with it. But Pope's Eye was obsolete as they were making it, so they just stopped. There was stories that the Cerberus, the ironclad warship which Victoria had, the first ironclad, was supposed to have been parked at Pope's Eye. It doesn't fit. It drew too much water to actually fit in there. So it's a furphy.
It was a Williamstown most of the time.
Sorry?
It was moored, my great-grandfather was on it, it was moored at Williamstown most of its...
Yes, yeah. They actually, there was a risk of war outbreak with Russia in 1885, and the Cerberus was supposed to go down to the Heads to take up his position, and they ended up towing it most of the way because the engines were totally useless. So they parked it in the spot and said, you know, let's hope the Russians don't come. So yeah, it was notorious for breaking down.
It was just used as an office.
Yeah.
At what point were the bunkers in the sand dunes down along Brimley and the others?
So dating from World War II, there's a whole network of bunkers, communications bunkers, machine gun bunkers. There's also artillery emplacements, and that goes all the way from Queenscliff through Lonsdale, Barwon Heads, Brimley, and there's a whole network of them. And it's almost identical to a system operating in the south of England when they were looking at defending against the German invasion.
On the early maps there, you started in 1862 or 3.
Yeah.
What sort of boats were you talking then? Sailing boats, were they, or not?
To get through there, sailing ships, yeah, with the occasional steamships, but mainly sailing.
It was steam, I haven't quite got the era on when steam came in.
Yeah. So but the main Russian navy operating out of Vladivostok was steam in the 1860s. There was a Confederate warship, the Shenandoah, arrived in 1865. It was steam and sail. Yeah. Just on that point, the Russians actually came through. There was a ship called the Bogatyr in 1862, passed through the Heads on a goodwill visit to Melbourne, and it fired a salute. And traditionally, the fort should have fired a salute back saying, "Welcome." Nothing. Turns out that the volunteer soldiers were still asleep in their beds, and they didn't have any ammunition for the guns. Very embarrassing. Yeah.
I've got newspaper cuttings of Germans landing on the shore in the Otway.
Yes.
When a German raider came through and put mines off Wilson's Prom,
the
Otway,
Yeah.
South Australia,
Yeah.
a number of reports of farmers going down and finding the remains supposedly of the German camp.
Yeah. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Yeah. Good.
One of the first safety professionals in the chemical industry was a fellow by the name of Trevor Kless. He wrote a number of books, and one of his books was called Organisations Have No Memory.
Okay.
And it was all about the fact that in the chemical industry they have accidents with action plans in place and all this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And 10 years later, all that's forgotten, and they have accidents exactly the same again.
Yes.
But what you've demonstrated there, again, is that highly sophisticated professional organisations have no memory.
That's right.
Yeah.
They've been so focused on offensive operations in Afghanistan and Iraq that they don't know how to defend. And that's why they're suddenly saying, well, what happened in the past? And they're absolutely fascinated by what we were saying, because we went into a lot of detail about what was happening at the Heads and how it developed, like in this talk, you know, from the 1860s to the complex ones of the 1940s, and the lessons you learnt, like it's no use just having the defences, you've actually got to defend as well, in case they're attacked from the rear. And it's now the Army saying, oh, okay, yeah, thanks for the heads up. So we're now advising, which is quite interesting, historians advising modern Army on how to do their job. Yep.
Sorry, I'm like a non-war historian and don't really understand a lot about war. Just simplistically, why would countries come to the bottom of Australia when most are northern? Why doesn't it come this way, down and attack the north? Because say if you look at the Second World War, it would have taken a lot of effort to come right around Australia and
Yep.
underneath.
Yeah.
Like, so tell me about how.
Why? That's a good question. Like, was Japan ever going to invade Australia? They certainly had plans for it, but reality said no, it was not going to happen. So what they decided instead was to interrupt the trade routes. They knew that Melbourne and Geelong were major industrial centres supplying the war effort, and that had to be shipped up north. So Japanese submarines were operating in Bass Strait. And same with German submarines as well. So yeah, even though the war seems to be a long way away, it's actually the logistics behind it that Melbourne and Geelong were so important to the war effort, and they knew that. Yeah. And that's why the Bellarine and Geelong and Queenscliff were so heavily defended, because they thought the Japanese could attack at any time. I mean, the reality is, no. We've just found an interesting report done in 1942, and it's a snapshot of Geelong and the Bellarine at one point in time. And it even had the number of troops, the number of rounds of machine gun ammunition, it had all this military stuff, and then you got into how many pounds of potatoes were grown to feed the troops. So it's an amazing snapshot, and that's probably going to be Andrew's doing his PhD on this at the moment. Sorry?
I don't know if you brought up with some of the work that we've done, another research arm. It was in 1942 the Japanese sub that launched a surveillance aircraft.
Yes, yeah.
And it went over Melbourne.
Yep.
It was shot at over Melbourne and wasn't hit. It had done the same over Sydney.
Yeah.
It then went on to other ports over in Fiji as well as New Zealand.
Yeah.
And it bombed that same aircraft was the first one to bomb North America with an incendiary.
Yeah.
So the Japanese subs were operating, and there were some, I think, 40 naval vessels being sunk or damaged on the east coast of Australia.
That's right.
By subs, by German and Japanese. So we were well and truly under attack.
Yeah. This interesting, we're talking about a submarine that actually had a hangar in front of the conning tower, the bit that sticks up, and it had a float plane which could be launched, and it launched in Bass Strait, flew over Queenscliff, went over Point Cook, dropped below the cloud cover, and he said, oh dear. He went straight back up again. And they flew over Melbourne, and I actually interviewed a fellow who was on an anti-aircraft battery in Melbourne in 1942, and he said it's a Japanese plane, and his officer said, no, it's American, no, it's Japanese, no, it's American, no, it's Japanese, and it just kept flying. And he eventually got picked up out in Bass Strait, but he pushed his luck too far. He did this quite a bit, and it was shot down after bombing in North America, and he survived the war. A fellow called Vegeta. Yeah. We're running out of time? Yeah. Yep. One last question.
We defended it from in front, we defended it from behind. What about inside? I used to go down there and play competition squash.
Yeah.
We have a beer afterwards.
Yeah.
That fridge had more chains and locks around it than I've ever seen in the building anywhere. Someone wasn't trusted inside.
No, that's right. Yeah. So that's just a little snippet about what we're working. So I think we need to get together and work on.
Well, thanks again for coming along.
Thank you.
Been a very interesting presentation.